Welcome to Inspired Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter Swoboda, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change. Now, this episode is essentially part 2 to opening men to therapy and therapy to men. So before we get into the guts of this one in terms of, okay, what is it that we need to do with therapy to make it more accessible to men, in my view, I just want to recap a couple of things from the previous episode, and that is, essentially we're talking about the impact of men through being socialized in the patriarchal ideology. There's some serious issues that people often don't connect. And one of the main points that I make in this space is that as much as we might see patriarchy as a sociological or political ideology, and for some people, it's their preferred way of looking at society and social relationships, this thing comes with an enormous cost, okay? And so I'm not going to focus on, the traditional issues about violence towards women, domestic violence, misogyny, abuse. I'm going to leave that. What I want to do with this particular episode is I want to focus on how do we help men to entertain the idea that reaching out for assistance, to consider living a life that isn't dictated by a traditional cultural idea about what men should be, but rather being able to be more free in who you are. I mean, especially since freedom at the moment has become a catch cry through the whole COVID pandemic in a very misguided way often. So, again, I'm not going to get onto that soapbox. I'm going to reserve that for possibly another time. So, what are some of the negative legacies about patriarchy, about the traditional idea about how men should be? Well, one of the things that I talk about is that aside from it being, having a massive impact sociologically and politically and economically, it has a direct impact on men's and women's mental health. Patriarchy is toxic psychologically, okay? And why can I say that with such confidence? Well, basically, for a start, there's been quite a bit of research, but more importantly, in my clinical work, one of the things that I see both in boys and in men is that the whole traditional conservative masculine view of men has resulted firstly in a reduced emotional vocabulary. The research in that's pretty clear, and I see that when I work with boys and men all the time. Sometimes it's as bad as being binary. How are you? Good. How was yesterday? Bad. What's school like? Okay. There's not a lot of nuance in describing what's happening for you emotionally. Now, the other important aspect here in patriarchal socialization is that it results in a reduced level of empathy. Now, part of that's responsible because you can't be, super competitive if you've got too much invested in understanding the other person, right? Sort of doesn't a lot of times seem fair. And the way that this articulates in individual relationships and including intimate partner relationships is that we end up competing with the person who we should be cooperating with, right? So it becomes a, but what about me scenario. So that could be about how we think, it could be how we feel. You know, I remember a woman once saying to me that the thing that she wanted most was a new age guy. This is in the late 80s, early 90s. At least he'd be in touch with his feelings. Now, to give it a bit of context, she had just come out of a relationship with a guy who was essentially emotionally completely cut off, had really no interest in what was going on for her emotionally, but, you know, wanted her to meet all his needs. And so eventually she had enough. She was a very high-powered businesswoman, and she stepped out of the relationship. So sometime later, she came back to me for therapy because, as she put it, I got what I wanted and I'm still not happy. Now that opens up a can of worms. And one of the things that she was describing was that whenever she tried to communicate with her new partner about what was going on for her, he would, you know, acknowledge what she was feeling, and, you know, he claimed that he completely understood what she was going through, and then the rest of the conversation was all about him. And after a while, she felt excluded in a way emotionally from the relationship. She couldn't just talk to him about what was going on for her and him just listen. It turned into often a competition who had, you know, deeper emotions, and it had more impact. And so she just essentially gave up. So again, it's one of the reasons why I talk a lot about the issue of empathy. And patriarchy doesn't like empathy because it doesn't allow you to be as selfish as patriarchy likes it to be. Now, another issue is fundamentally a reduced level of self-awareness. And this can be in respect to your physical being. It's definitely part of your emotional being as a, you know, well-trained, conventional patriarchal male. But it's also often related to your sense of lack of awareness in issues like beliefs, attitudes, values. We are getting better at that, but it's still pretty low. One of the things that I consistently have to deal with a lot of men is their propensity to overtrain so that their physical system is stressed out to the max and they're not giving it a really good go at recovery. And so after a while, you know, injuries and so on become this chronic issue for a lot of men. The other part of it is not necessarily understanding what to look for when it comes to my emotional well-being. We often compartmentalize things. You know, it's one of the, you know, often in a binary way. So I'm either really good or I'm bad. And that applies physically but also emotionally, let alone when we start talking about social awareness. So that's a really important aspect to it too. The other aspect of it that I see with men, and that's the fourth issue that I'd have a tendency to, you know, spend quite a bit of time with men on, is, you know, a decreased emotional, behavioural and cognitive flexibility. One of my experiences has been over time recognising that traditional men, patriarchal men, tend to be rigid. And that rigidity often is expressed in their body. It's definitely there emotionally, but also in the sort of cognitive realm, their ideas about things. They are very reluctant to change, and they employ, you know, a sophisticated set of defense mechanisms to keep themselves ticking along with their status quo. So the next issue is that patriarchal socialization makes men prone to what I refer to as acquired narcissism. Okay, so in order to compensate for my feelings of inadequacy or my sense of a lack of self, I have to inflate my sense of self to the external world. Right? So, the message is I'm better than what I think, but I'm definitely better than what you guys are. So this also raises the next issue, which is that a lot of men are highly sensitive to criticism. We don't like it. Now I'll throw myself into that mix too. It took me a long time to work through not feeling hurt when my partner or someone is trying to give me some positive or even just some feedback or being critical of me. And I learned how to process that. And in another podcast, I'm going to go through that in more detail. The other issue, and this is an important one, is that patriarchal men tend to have a greater sensitivity to shame. In fact, my argument is that most of us as men at some point or another need to understand guilt and shame to a high degree in order for ourselves to grow personally. Because again, when we have these feelings of guilt and shame, we're going to use defense mechanisms to protect ourselves from encountering those feelings in an authentic way. Finally, one of the big problems with all of this is that patriarchy makes us not particularly resilient. All of this mix that I've talked about actually makes us quite vulnerable, but in a negative sense. We're not vulnerable in a constructive sense. So, how does that then influence therapy? Okay, so let me begin here by saying that, firstly, therapy, as I explained earlier on, was essentially put together by men for women. Okay, so therapy has a particular bias. Most women don't necessarily relate or think about this in a great deal, but I'm asking women therapists to think about this, particularly with their male clients. The problem that I have in this space is that, my experience with women is they're coming to therapy to talk, right? So we come back to that whole point of therapy being a meaningful conversation. However, most men come to therapy or go into treatment, firstly with a great deal of suspicion and constantly waiting to be criticised, or as one guy put it to me very bluntly, I need to get fixed because my partner's not happy with me. Interesting way of looking at it. So the whole thing, which is classic in traditional men's thinking, is you're either whole or good, or you're bad or broken. And so here's the problem. This is the solution. And therapy is going to fix me. So certainly if you've got any psychological disorder, there is a need to address that. But I talk about that in a process of healing rather than getting fixed. Because I don't see anxiety, depression, and so on necessarily as a deficit or a biological illness. What it is in most instances an adaptive process by this human trying to be. And I think that's a very important distinction. So, what does that entail then in making therapy accessible to men is we need to, as a therapist, reframe their experience after we've really established a powerful rapport. A rapport that's not based on some form of judgment or, inherent criticism. The last thing most of us as men need is another critical parent, whether that be our real parent or our partner or our therapist. So that's a very important aspect to this. And in some instances, and this is why a lot of guys get a little bit defensive, or a lot defensive, when I start talking about the issue about patriarchy and masculinity, because they immediately jump to the conclusion that I'm one of those guys who see men through the eyes of women, and therefore